My name is Irene Walker. I am 32 years old, and 5 years ago my older sister told my parents that I had dropped out of medical school. It was a complete lie, but it cost me my entire family. They blocked my number, they returned my letters, unopened. They didn't come to my graduation, and they weren't at my wedding for 5 years. I was no longer anyone's daughter. But everything changed one night in January when an emergency case was rushed into the hospital where I work, and the name on the chart made my mother almost collapse when she saw me walk into the operating room. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand that what took place, that the night was not a coincidence, but the result of a lie that had been carefully built over years. If this story resonates with you, make sure to like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to follow this until the end, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story has reached. Now, let me take you back to the fall of 2019, to a small kitchenware. For the last time in my life, I believed I had finally been seen by my family growing up. There were 2 daughters in our house, but only one of us truly existed in my parents' eyes. My sister Emily was always the center of attention. She was outgoing, confident, and could make anyone like her within minutes, while I was the opposite, quiet, buried in books, learning not to expect too much from the people who were supposed to care the most. My father managed a manufacturing plant, and my mother worked part-time as an accountant, and to them, 2 things mattered above everything else: appearances and obedience. Emily had both. I had nothing but good grades. I never caused trouble, but I was never the reason they were proud either. There is a difference between being forgotten and never being seen at all, and I lived in that space for years. I remember in 8th grade, I was the only student from my school to make it to the state science fair. While on that, the same weekend, Emily had a theater performance, and you can probably guess where my parents chose to go. When I came home with a 2nd place ribbon, my father glanced at it and said, "Good job." Before walking away, he didn't ask what my project was about, and he never did. I told myself it didn't matter. I poured everything into my studies because I believed that if I couldn't be the daughter they loved, then I would become the daughter they couldn't ignore. And for a brief moment, I succeeded. The day I received my acceptance letter to a medical school in Oregon, 3,000 miles away, my father looked at me and said, "Maybe you'll finally make something of yourself." And that was the closest thing to praise I had ever received from him. I held on to those words like they were oxygen, without realizing that moment was also when everything began to shift in ways I couldn't control. That night, my mother called relatives, and for the first time in my life, I heard pride in her voice when she spoke about me, while Emily sat across from me with a perfect smile. But her eyes were telling a completely different story at the loan. At time I thought she was just tired, but later, I would understand. That was the moment she started calculating. In the days that followed, she began calling me, more often asking about my schedule, my friends, every small detail of my life. And I told her everything, because I believed we were finally becoming real sisters. I didn't know I was handing her everything she needed to destroy me, and if I could go back to that moment, I would stay silent. But at that time, I was just a 2-3-year-old girl who had finally felt seen by her family, and I didn't realize that the spotlight had just turned me into a target. Growing up in our house, there were always 2 versions of reality happening at the same time: the one everyone saw and the one I lived through. And those 2 versions never overlapped. My sister Emily was the version my parents proudly showed on the world. She was the one they talked about at dinners, the one they introduced with excitement, the one whose stories were told over and over again like highlights in a reel. She was naturally charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately own it. Teachers loved her neighbors, adored her relatives. He remembered her birthdays. Without reminders, she didn't just exist in our family. She defined it. And then there was me, quiet, predictable, easy to overlook. I learned very early that attention in our house was something you had to earn, but also something that wasn't meant for me, not really. Because no matter what I did, it always seemed to fall just short of being worth noticing. My parents weren't cruel in an obvious way. They didn't yell at me or tell me I wasn't good enough. It was more subtle than that. It was in the way conversations would shift when I spoke, in the way my achievements. They were acknowledged quickly and then forgotten, in the way Emily's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like milestones, while mine were treated like expectations. And when something becomes an expectation, it stops being special. I remember dinners where Emily would talk for 20 minutes straight about a school play rehearsal, while I sat there waiting for a pause that never came, and when I did, to finally say something, it would be met with a distracted nod, before the focus returned to her over time. I stopped trying. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood that no one was really listening, and that realization changes you. It teaches you to shrink yourself without even noticing, to take up less space, to need less, to expect less. I became good at observing instead of participating, at watching people instead of being seen by them, and in a strange way that helped me. It made me disciplined, focused, independent. I didn't rely on validation because I rarely received it, so I built my identity around something else: achievement, numbers, results, things that couldn't be ignored, even if no one cared to celebrate them. School became my safe place because it was one of the few environments where effort translated directly into recognition. Teachers didn't compare me to Emily. They saw me for what I did, not for what I wasn't, and for the first time, that felt like control, like I could shape my own value, instead of waiting for someone else to assign it to me. But even then, the gap at home never really closed. It just became quieter. They're more normalized, like background noise. You stop noticing after a while. There were moments that should have mattered, moments that would have meant something in a different family, like the time I stayed up for 3 nights straight finishing a biology project that ended up winning second place at the state level. I remember standing there holding that ribbon thinking, maybe this time would be different. Maybe this would be enough to make them look at me the way they looked at her. But when I got home, my father glanced at it for less than 2 seconds and said, "Good job," before turning back to the television. My mother smiled briefly and asked if I had finished my homework for the next day, and just like that, the moment, it was gone. It didn't disappear dramatically. It just faded, like it had never really existed in the first place. And I told myself that was fine, that I didn't need more than that I was okay being the daughter who didn't require attention, because accepting that felt easier than constantly being disappointed. But acceptance and truth are not the same thing. Deep down, there was always a part of me that wondered what it would feel like to be chosen, to be prioritized, to be the person someone was proud of without hesitation. And that question stayed with me, quietly, shaping every decision I made, pushing me toward a path where I thought, maybe, just maybe, I could force that recognition into existence, and that path became medicine. Not because it was easy, or even because it was my dream at the beginning, but because it was undeniable. Becoming a doctor wasn't something that could be overlooked or minimized. It was definitive. It was something that demanded acknowledgement, and I convinced myself that if I could reach that level, if I could achieve something that significant, then the dynamic in my family would have to change. They would have to see me differently. They would have to finally recognize me. And for the first time in my life, I had a goal that felt bigger than just proving something to myself. It felt like a way to rewrite the role I had been given, to step out of the background and into something that couldn't be ignored. But what I didn't understand back then was that changing yourself, it doesn't always change the system you're part of. Sometimes it just exposes it more clearly, and sometimes the moment you finally step into the light is the exact moment someone else decides they're not willing to let you stay there. The week, everything started to shift, felt almost ordinary at first, which is probably why I didn't recognize it for what it was, because if you're used to being overlooked, you don't expect change to come in a way that matters. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the acceptance letter arrived. A plain envelope that didn't look important enough to carry the weight it actually held. I remember staring at it for a long time before opening it, not because I was afraid I hadn't gotten in, but because I didn't know what it would mean if I had. When I finally unfolded the letter and read the words I had been working toward for years, I didn't react the way people expect. There was no screaming or jumping or calling everyone I knew there was. Just this quiet moment where everything I had built in my head suddenly became real, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think maybe things were about to change. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were sitting and handed the letter to my father. He adjusted his glasses, read it slowly, and I watched his expression more than I listened to his words, because I had spent my whole life trying to read him, trying to predict when something might actually reach him. His eyebrows lifted slightly, just enough for me to notice, and then he said, "Oregon Medical and Science University," like he was testing how it sounded out loud, and then he looked at me, really looked at me and said, "Maybe you'll finally make something of yourself." It wasn't warm, it wasn't proud in the way I had imagined, but it was more than I had ever gotten before, and that was enough, more than enough. I held on to that moment, like it was proof that everything I believed was finally coming true, that hard work could change perception, that I could step out of the role I had been given and into something new that night. My mother called relatives, her voice carrying through the house as she repeated the news again and again, and there was something different in it, something lighter, something closer to pride than obligation, and I sat there listening to her talk about me in a way she never had before, feeling like I was hearing a version of myself that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. And across the table, Emily smiled, supportive, attentive, asking questions about my schedule, my classes, the city I would be moving to, and I remember feeling grateful, not suspicious, because I wanted to believe that this moment wasn't just changing how my parents saw me, but how she saw me too. Over the next few days, she became more involved than she had ever been, calling me regularly, asking about everything, who my roommate would be, what my classes looked like, which professors I was excited about, even small details like what time my lecture started and where I would be living. She remembered things I told her, brought them up later, followed up on them, and it felt like something I had missed my entire life, like I was finally part of something instead of watching it from the outside. And I gave her everything, every detail, every thought, every uncertainty, because I thought, that's what trust looked like. That's what having a sister was supposed to feel like. I didn't see the pattern forming, didn't question why she needed to know so much. I didn't notice the way she guided the conversations, steering them toward specific topics, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, making sure she understood every angle of my life, because to me, it felt like care, not strategy. And that was my mistake. The kind of mistake you only recognize when it's already too late to undo it. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. The shift in attention, the way the focus in our family started to move slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, from her to me, and how uncomfortable that made her, not in a way she would ever admit, but in the small changes, the tighter smile, the slightly longer pauses before she responded, the way she listened just a little too carefully, like she was measuring something instead of sharing it. But at the time, I didn't have the experience to interpret any of that. I just thought we were finally becoming closer, that the gap between us was closing, that whatever distance had existed was being replaced with something real. And that belief made me open it, made me honest in a way I had never been before. I told her about my fears, about the pressure I felt, about how I didn't want to fail after coming this far, about how much it meant to me that our parents finally seemed to notice me, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, without judging, just absorbing, storing it somewhere I couldn't see. And if you had asked me then, I would have said that was the moment everything started to get better. That was the beginning of a new chapter where things finally made sense. But what I didn't understand was that I wasn't stepping into a better version of my life. I was stepping into a situation I didn't yet have the perspective to recognize, because while I believed I was building a connection, she was building something else entirely, something that required information, timing, and patience. and by the time I realized what she had been doing with everything I had given her, it would already be too late to take any of it back. By my 3rd year of medical school, my life had settled into a rhythm that was intense but predictable: long hours, constant pressure, and the kind of exhaustion that becomes so familiar you stop questioning it. But it was also the first time in my life where I felt like I truly belonged, somewhere where I wasn't being compared to anyone else, where my work spoke for itself, and a big part of that stability came from one person, my roommate, Sarah Mitchell. She was the opposite of everything I had grown up with. She didn't come from a perfect family. She didn't come from any real family at all. She had grown up in foster care, moving from place to place, learning early on that if she wanted something in life, she had to fight for it herself. And maybe that's why we understood each other in a way I had never experienced before. She didn't need explanations. She didn't need me to prove anything. She just saw me, and that alone made her more of a family to me than anyone I had left behind. We studied together. We survived exams together. We built routines that made the chaos of medical school feel manageable, and for the first time I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the background character in someone else's story. He was part of something real, and then everything changed in a way that no amount of preparation could have prepared me for it. It started with small symptoms, things that didn't seem serious at first: fatigue, weight loss, a persistent pain that she kept brushing off because we were both too busy to stop, too focused on getting through the next exam, the next rotation, the next milestone, until one day she collapsed, and within a week, we had a diagnosis that we didn't feel real, even when we were staring directly at it. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, aggressive, late, and unforgiving. The kind of diagnosis that comes with timelines instead of treatment plans, and suddenly none of the things we had been stressing about mattered anymore. The grades didn't matter, schedules didn't matter. Nothing mattered except time and how little of it we had. I remember sitting in that sterile hospital room, listening to the oncologist explain options that weren't really options, watching Sarah nod like she understood, even though we both knew what he was saying, without him having to say it directly. And something in me shifted in that moment, something that had been building for years without me realizing it all. Distance, all the independence, all the ways I had learned to rely on myself instead of others. It all pointed to one decision that suddenly felt obvious. I went to the administration office the next morning and requested a leave of absence, not because I was failing, not because I couldn't handle the workload, but because someone I cared about needed me, and I wasn't going to walk away from that. The paperwork was straightforward, documented, approved without resistance. My place in the program was secured, for when I returned, everything was official, clear, and legitimate. There was nothing secretive about it, nothing to hide, and that's why what happened next still feels so surreal. Even now, I moved into Sarah's apartment. He turned her living room into a space where she could rest comfortably, drove her to appointments, sat with her through treatments that drained the life out of her faster than the illness itself, learned how to manage medications, how to read charts from the other side, how to be present in a way that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with being human. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I made a decision that I didn't think would matter. I called my sister. I told her everything about the diagnosis, about my leave, about why I was stepping away for a semester. I explained it clearly, calmly, the same way I would explain a case to a colleague, and she responded exactly how I needed her to her voice. Soft, sympathetic, understanding. She told me she was proud of me for staying, that I was doing the right thing, that she wouldn't say anything to our parents because she knew they would worry. And in that moment, I believed her completely, because nothing in her tone suggested anything else. Nothing in her words hinted at what she would do next. And maybe that's the part that matters the most. Not just that she lied, but that she knew exactly how to sound like she. It wasn't going to 3 days later while I was sitting beside Sarah's, the hospital bed in the middle of the night, listening to the steady rhythm of machines that were doing more work than her body could. My phone lit up with a call from my father, and something about that moment felt wrong. Before I even answered, because he never called me that late, not unless something was already broken. And when I picked up, I didn't hear concern. I didn't hear confusion. I heard certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from believing you already know the truth. And in that instant, before he even finished his first sentence, I realized that everything I had trusted, everything I had shared, had already been turned into something else entirely. My father didn't waste time with questions. He didn't ask if I was okay, or where I was, or what had happened. He spoke like a man, delivering a verdict that had already been decided. His voice cold, controlled, almost unfamiliar. He said that my sister had told them everything that they knew about me, dropping out about the lies about the life I had apparently been hiding, and for a moment I genuinely thought there had been some kind of mistake, that he had the wrong information or that something had been misunderstood. But then he mentioned details, specific things that I had only ever told Emily, and that was when the realization hit. Not all at once, but in pieces, like something breaking slowly enough for you to feel every part of it. I tried to explain. I told him about Sarah, about the diagnosis, about the leave of absence that had been approved by the school. I told him I could send documents, contacts, anything they needed to verify it, but he didn't respond to any of that. It was like I was speaking into a space where my words no longer had any weight, like the version of me he believed had already replaced the one I actually was. The mother got on the phone next, her voice shaking but not with doubt, with disappointment. She asked me how I could lie to them for so long, how I could throw away everything they had sacrificed for me. And I remember standing there in the hallway outside Sarah's room trying to keep my voice steady while everything inside me was starting to collapse. I told her I wasn't lying, that none of it was true, that I was still in the program, that I had only taken a temporary leave, but every time I spoke it, I felt like I was digging myself deeper into something I couldn't see, because they had already decided what the truth was, and anything I said after that just sounded like denial to them. My father cut me off before I could finish. He said he didn't want to hear any more excuses, that I had embarrassed the family enough. And then he said something that I would replay in my head for years after he told me not to call again, until I was ready to tell the truth. And then the line went dead. Just like that. No pause, no hesitation, no space for anything else. I stood there staring at my phone. The screen still lit up with the call duration, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. That was how long it took for my entire place in that family to disappear. I didn't cry right away. I think part of me was still trying to process what had just happened. Trying to find some way to make it make sense, because none of it did. 3 days earlier, my sister had told me she understood, that she supported me, that she wouldn't say anything, and now everything I had told her had been turned into evidence against me, and I didn't even know what that evidence looked like, to what she had said, what she had shown them, how she had made it convincing enough for them to believe her without question. About 20 minutes later, a message came through from her. Short, simple, almost casual. She said she was sorry that she'd stare. He had to tell them that she couldn't keep my secret anymore. And there was something about that message that felt worse than the call, because it wasn't emotional, it wasn't desperate, it was controlled. Like she had already accepted the outcome before I even knew what was happening, and that was when it really sank in. This wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. I tried calling back once, twice, again, and again, but it went straight to voicemail. And by the fourth call, I realized my number had already been blocked. I switched to messaging, sent texts, explaining everything as clearly as I could. No response. I emailed them. Attached the official documents from the university, the approval for my leave, the contact information for the department, anything that could prove I was telling the truth. I even included details about Sarah's condition, her doctor, the hospital, thinking that if they could verify even one part of what I was saying, it might change something. But nothing came back. No reply, no acknowledgement, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but final, like a door that has been closed and locked from the other side over the next few days. I kept trying, calling from different numbers, sending longer messages, explaining it in different ways, hoping that maybe I just hadn't said it right. The first time that maybe there was some version of the truth they would be willing to hear. But each attempt ended the same way: ignored, rejected, or blocked. And all the while I was still taking care of Sarah, still showing up to appointments, still sitting beside her bed at night, pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. And there was a moment somewhere in the middle of all that where I realized I had run out of ways to reach them, not just practically, but emotionally. There was nothing left to say that I hadn't already. I said nothing left to prove that I hadn't already offered, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be completely cut off, not because I had walked away, but because they had decided I no longer belonged, and that decision, once it was made, didn't leave any room for me to change it. The days that followed didn't feel real. They felt stretched, distorted, like time had slowed down just enough for everything to hurt more clearly. I stopped calling after the 6th day, not because I didn't want to keep trying, but because I finally understood that I wasn't being unheard. I was being ignored on purpose. There's a difference between someone not knowing the truth and someone choosing not to believe it. And once that choice is made, there's nothing you can say that will undo it. I had called 14 times in 5 days, sent messages, emails, even a letter that was returned unopened with my mother's handwriting on the envelope, and that image stayed with me longer than anything else. Not the words, not the silence, but the fact that she had physically sent it back without even looking inside. Like whatever I had to say no longer deserved to exist in their world. I tried reaching out to my Aunt Ruth, the only person in my family who had ever treated me like I mattered equally. I explained everything to her, every detail, every piece of proof, and she believed me. I could hear it in her voice, the anger, the confusion, the way she kept saying, this didn't make sense, that she would talk to my parents, that she would fix it. And for a brief moment, I let myself hope again, not because I thought everything would go back to normal, but because I thought at least the truth would be heard. But 40 minutes after she called them, she called me back, and I knew before she even spoke that it hadn't worked. Her voice was quieter, heavier. She said my father told her not to interfere, that this was something I had brought on myself, and that was it. No discussion, no willingness to reconsider, just a decision that had already been made and locked in place. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that felt empowering or strong, but in a quiet, almost numb way, like a door closing somewhere deep inside that I didn't know how to reopen. I stopped trying after that, not because I didn't care, but because I realized caring wasn't enough when the other side had already decided who you were. Sarah's condition was getting worse during all of this. The treatments weren't working the way we had hoped, and the reality we had been trying not to say out loud was becoming impossible to ignore. She was running out of time, and suddenly, the situation with my family, as painful as it was, I felt secondary to what was happening right in front of me. Because unlike them, she was still there, still fighting, still someone I could show up for. So I focused on that. I put everything I had into being present for her, into making sure she wasn't alone in the moments that mattered. I learned how to sit in silence without trying to fix it, how to hold her hand when the pain became too much, how to be steady even when I felt like I was falling apart internally. There's something about watching someone you care about slowly fade that changes your understanding of everything. It strips away the things you thought were important and leaves you with what actually is. And in those final weeks, I understood something that I hadn't before. That love isn't always loud or visible or acknowledged. Sometimes it's just showing up over and over again, even when there's nothing you can do to change the outcome. The morning she passed was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural in a hospital. I was sitting beside her, half awake, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor. And then it wasn't steady anymore. There was no dramatic moment. No last speech, just a gradual slowing until everything stopped, and I remember looking at the screen at the line that had gone flat, and feeling like something inside me had gone with it because she had been the one constant in my life during the hardest period I had ever gone through. The one person who had seen me without judgment, without expectation, and now she was gone too. I organized a small service for her a few days later. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet gathering with a few people who had known her, a couple of classmates, a nurse from the oncology ward, someone from her past who had driven in to be there, 6 people in a room that could hold 60, and I stood at the front and spoke about her, about who she was, about the way she made people feel, about the strength she had carried even when her body couldn't keep up. And I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because I had already used up everything I had in the weeks leading up to that moment. Grief doesn't always come out when you expect it to. Sometimes it settles somewhere deeper, quieter, and stays there. After the service, I went back to the apartment, her apartment, the space we had shared for months, and everything was still there. Her coffee cup on the counter, her jacket by the door, small details that made it feel like she might walk back in at any moment. And I sat there for a long time, not doing anything, just existing in that silence. And eventually, I opened my laptop and pulled up the form to re-enroll for the next semester. It was still there, waiting, unchanged. Like the rest of the world had continued moving forward, even while mine had stopped, and I stared at it for a long time before making a decision, because at that point, there were only 2 directions left for me. I could stay where I was stuck, in everything that had happened, or I could move forward, not because things were okay, but because they weren't, and staying would only make it worse. And in the end, I chose to continue, not for my parents, not to prove anything to anyone who had already decided I wasn't worth believing, but for her, for the version of me she had believed in, even when I didn't. And as I submitted the form, I realized that I wasn't just going back. To school, I was stepping into a life that no longer had any connection to, the one I had lost. The decision to go back wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a sense of clarity or motivation the way people like to describe turning points. It was quiet, almost mechanical, like choosing to take the next step simply because standing still was no longer an option. When I returned to medical school in January, everything looked exactly the same on the surface. The same buildings, the same lecture halls, the same routines that had once felt overwhelming, but now felt distant, almost detached. Like I was stepping back into a version of my life that no longer fully belonged to me. People asked where I had been, some out of curiosity, some out of politeness, and I gave them simple answers. Family situation needed time back. Now I didn't explain further because I had learned that explanations, I didn't always change how people saw you, and I didn't have the energy to try to control that anymore. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my work, my time, my progress. I rebuilt my schedule piece by piece, adding structure back into days that had lost all sense of it. Early mornings, long hours in the lab, late nights reviewing material. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. Not to my parents, not to my sister, not even to the people around me. It was about something simpler and more direct, survival, moving forward in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And in that sense, it was different from anything I had done before. Because for the first time, the motivation was internal, not driven by the hope that someone might finally notice, but by the understanding that it didn't matter if they ever did. The first few weeks were the hardest, not because of the workload, but because of the silence, the absence of any connection to the life I had left behind. No calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that I existed outside of the space I was currently in. And that kind of silence forces you to confront things you might otherwise avoid. It makes you realize how much of your identity was tied to people who are no longer there, and how little of it you've defined on your own. I spent a lot of nights alone during that time, sitting in my apartment going over notes that I already understood, just to keep my mind occupied, because when I wasn't working, the thoughts would come back. The conversations I had replayed over and over again. The moments where I wondered if I could have said something differently, done something differently, changed the outcome in some way. But every time I followed that line of thinking, it led to the same place, a version of reality where I was, still trying to convince people who had already decided not to believe me. And eventually I stopped going down that path. Not because it stopped hurting, but because it stopped being useful. There's a point where you have to accept that closure isn't something you're always given. Sometimes it's something you create by deciding to move on without it, and that realization didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. I threw myself into clinical rotations when they started long, shifts in the hospital that left no room for anything else. 12, sometimes 14 hours at a time, moving from one patient to the next, learning how to make decisions quickly, how to stay focused under pressure, how to separate emotion from action when necessary. And in a strange way, that environment gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. The direction in the hospital, there was no ambiguity about what needed to be done. No hidden meanings, no unspoken judgments. There were problems, and there were solutions. And if you were capable, you acted. If you weren't, you learned until you were. And that kind of clarity became something I relied on, something that grounded me when everything else felt uncertain. I started picking up extra shifts, volunteering for cases that other people avoided, not because I wanted recognition, but because staying busy kept everything else at a distance. And over time, that effort started to show my evaluations. Improved attendings began to trust me with more responsibility. And for the first time in my life, the acknowledgement I was receiving felt different, not conditional, not dependent on who I was compared to someone else, but based on what I actually did. And that difference mattered more than I expected. It didn't replace what I had lost, but it filled a space that had been empty for a long time. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking my phone for missed calls that were never going to come, stopped expecting holidays to feel like anything other than regular days, stopped waiting for something external to change before allowing myself to move forward. And that shift didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable, until I looked back and realized how far I had come from the person who had been sitting on that hospital floor months earlier. And even though the pain, it didn't disappear, it changed. It became something I could carry instead of something that controlled me, something that existed alongside everything else, instead of defining it. And that was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to keep going. Enough to build something new on top of what had been broken, enough to become someone who didn't need permission to move forward anymore. The years that followed didn't feel like a comeback. Not in the dramatic sense. People like to imagine there was no single moment where everything suddenly became worth it. No instant where the past stopped mattering. Instead, it was a slow, consistent process of building something stable out of what had been completely broken. I graduated on time, quietly, without an audience, without family in the crowd, without anyone calling my name, except the person reading it off a list. And when I walked across that stage, I didn't look out into the seats because there was no one there for me to find. And I had already made peace with that, or at least a version of peace that allowed me to keep moving after graduation. Matched into a surgical residency at Mercy Rest Medical Center A, Level 1. Trauma center on the East Coast. The kind of place where everything moves fast and nothing waits for you to catch up, where mistakes are costly and hesitation can be the difference between life and death. And that environment suited me in a way I hadn't expected because it didn't leave space for anything unnecessary. There was no room for self-doubt. No time to think about the past, only the next decision, the next patient, the next problem that needed to be solved. The hours were brutal, the expectations even more so. But for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be, not because it was easy, but because it was clear. And in that clarity, I found something that had been missing for a long time. Purpose that didn't depend on anyone else during my second year of residency. I met Dr. Margaret Thornton. She was the head of trauma surgery, known for being precise, direct, and completely intolerant of anything less than your best. Most people found her intimidating, but I recognized something in the way she operated, not just in surgery, but in how she carried herself. There was no excess, no need for approval, just competence and control. And over time, she became more than just a supervisor. She became a mentor, the kind of person who doesn't offer comfort, but gives you something more valuable: standards. She pushed me harder than anyone else expected, more than I thought I was capable of, and when I met those expectations, she didn't praise me, she raised them. And that was exactly what I needed, because he forced me to grow without relying on validation somewhere in the middle. Of all that I met Nathan, he wasn't part of the hospital system. He was a civil rights attorney, volunteering at a community clinic nearby. We met by chance, if you can call anything that, during a long shift, where I hadn't slept in over 20 hours, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain. At the time, I told him more about myself than I had told anyone in years, not all at once, not in detail, but enough for him to understand the shape of it, the absence, the distance, the things I didn't say as much as the things I did. And he didn't react the way people usually do. There was no sympathy that felt misplaced, no attempt to fix something that couldn't be undone. He just listened, and then he said something simple, something that stayed with me longer than I expected. He said, "I deserved better," not in a way that dismissed what had happened, but in a way that acknowledged it without letting it define everything that came after. And that was different. That was something I hadn't experienced before. We got married 3 years later, in a small ceremony in Dr. Thornton's backyard. About 30 people, close friends, colleagues, people who had become my chosen family over time. Nathan's father walked me down the aisle, a moment that should have belonged to someone else but didn't anymore. And I accepted that, not as a replacement, but as a reality. I sent an invitation to my parents, not because I expected them to come, but because it felt like something I needed to do for myself. A way of leaving the door open without standing in front of it waiting. The invitation was returned, unopened, just like the letters before. And when I held it in my hands, I didn't feel the same sharp pain I once had. It was different now, quieter, more distant, like something I had already processed in a way. That didn't require a reaction anymore. Ruth came. She cried enough for everyone who wasn't there. And in that moment I realized that family doesn't always mean who you start with. Sometimes it's who shows up when it matters. After the ceremony, Dr. Thornton handed me an envelope sealed with my name on it. She told me it was a nomination, something she had submitted on my behalf, but that I shouldn't open it yet, that I wasn't ready, and I didn't question it. I had learned to trust her judgment, so I put it away in a drawer and went back to my life, back to the routines that had become my foundation, back to the work that defined my days. And over the next few years, I continued to move forward in ways that didn't feel dramatic, but were undeniably real. I advanced through residency, took on more responsibility, became someone others relied on, not because of who I was connected to, but because of what I could do. And at some point along the way, I stopped thinking of my life as something that had been taken from me and started seeing it as something I had built piece by piece, decision by decision, without the support I once thought I needed. And that shift changed everything. Not the past, not what had happened, but how much power it had over me. Because for the first time, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had created in its place. By the time I turned 32, my life looked nothing like the one I had lost. And from the outside, it probably seemed complete, stable career, a home in a quiet neighborhood, a routine that made sense, a future that felt predictable in the way I had once thought I needed. I had become the head of trauma surgery at Mercy Rest, a position that came with responsibility, pressure, and a level of trust that I had spent years earning. My days started before sunrise and often ended long after it had set, filled with decisions that mattered, outcomes that couldn't be undone, and a team that relied on me to be steady no matter what was happening around us, and I was steady, focused, reliable. I had built that version of myself carefully, layer by layer, until it became second nature at home. Things were quieter. Nathan had a way of balancing everything without trying to control it. He didn't ask questions. I didn't want to answer, didn't push where I wasn't ready to go, but he was always there, consistent in a way that didn't demand anything in return. We had a small house with a front porch that caught the morning light, a dog that followed me from room to room like it had decided. I was its entire world, and for the most part, that was enough, more than enough. But there are certain absences that don't disappear, no matter how full your life becomes. They don't interrupt your day. They don't demand attention, but they exist in the background, in quiet moments, in holidays that feel slightly incomplete in the brief pause, when you realize there's no one to call from a place, or that used to matter. I didn't think about my parents every day, not anymore, but they were still there, in a way that was hard to define, not present, not gone, just unresolved. Ruth still called every Sunday. She was the only connection that remained, the only thread that hadn't been cut. And through her, I learned things I never asked to know, small updates about people I no longer spoke to. My parents were still living in the same house, still following the same routines, my father still working, my mother still managing everything quietly in the background. And Emily, she had divorced 2 years earlier, was now working in medical sales, a detail that carried a kind of irony I didn't need to comment on. I listened when Ruth spoke, but I didn't engage. Beyond that, I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer opinions, because I had learned that knowing more didn't change anything. It just made the distance more specific. One evening, about a week before everything changed, Ruth called and her tone was different, more hesitant, like she was choosing her words, carefully before saying them. She said there was something I needed to know about Emily, something that had been happening for a while. And before she could finish, my pager went off, the sharp sound cutting through the conversation in a way that immediately shifted my focus. Trauma alert level 1, incoming patient. I told her I had to go, that I would call her back later, and I meant it. But I never got the chance because whatever I was about to tell me didn't stay in the realm of conversation. It became something immediate, something real, something that was already on its way to me, whether I was ready for it or not. The call came in just after 3 a.m, the kind of hour where everything feels slightly unreal, where the world is quiet enough that any disruption feels amplified. I was asleep when the pager went off, the sound pulling me out of a dream I couldn't remember. Nathan stirred beside me, but I didn't fully wake. I checked the screen. Trauma level 1 motor vehicle accident, female mid-30s, unstable vitals 8 minutes out. I was out of bed in less than a minute, moving through a routine that had become automatic, clothes on, keys in hand, out the door. The drive to the hospital was empty, the roads dark and clear, my mind already shifting into focus, running through possibilities, internal bleeding organ, damage, what we might be dealing with, when the patient, he arrived. This was familiar. This was what I was trained for, what I had done hundreds of times before. By the time I walked into the emergency department, the team was already assembling. Residents, nurses, anesthesia, everyone moving with the same sense of urgency that comes with cases like this. I grabbed the tablet with the incoming patient's information more out of habit than anything else and scanned the details. Quickly name, age, status, and then I stopped. Not because I didn't, I understand what I was reading, but because I did, because the name on that screen was one I hadn't seen in 5 years, but recognized instantly. Emily Walker, date of birth matching exactly, emergency contact listed as my father, and for a brief moment, everything around me seemed to fade. The noise, the movement, the urgency, all of it pulled back just enough for that single detail to take up all the space. And in that moment, it wasn't just the surgeon preparing for a case I was standing at, the intersection of 2 lives that had been completely separate until now. and I realized that whatever happened next wasn't going to stay in the past. It was about to collide with the present in a way none of us could control. The ambulance doors burst open with a force that snapped everything back into motion. The paramedics moving fast, voices overlapping as they pushed the stretcher toward us, calling out vitals, blood pressure dropping, heart rate elevated, possible internal bleeding. The kind of report I had heard hundreds of times before, the kind that usually triggered nothing but focus and precision. But this time, there was something else underneath it, something I had to force down before it interfered with what needed to be done. I stepped forward with my team, my voice steady as I took control of the room, directing movements, assigning roles, initiating protocols, everything automatic, everything practiced, because that's what training does. It gives. If you structure when everything else is chaos, and for those first few minutes, that structure was the only thing keeping me grounded. The patient was unconscious, pale, blood staining the front of her clothes, oxygen mask fogging with shallow breaths, her body responding the way any trauma patient would, not as a person I knew, but as a case that needed to be solved quickly and correctly. We transferred her to the trauma bed, monitors, attached IV lines, checked fluids, running. I called for imaging, for labs, for surgical prep, each decision stacking on top of the last, without hesitation, because hesitation is what costs lives in situations like this. And yet, even as I moved through the process, I could feel the awareness sitting just behind it, not interfering, but present a constant reminder of who she was beyond the diagnosis. In front of me, I forced myself not to look at her face for longer than necessary, not to search for familiarity in the features that had changed over time, because that wasn't relevant, not right now. What mattered was the damage, the bleeding, the time we had left to act. The scans came back quickly, faster than usual, as if the urgency in the room had carried through every step of the process. Ruptured spleen, significant liver laceration, internal hemorrhaging that was already progressing. This wasn't a case that could wait. This was immediate surgical. Critical. I turned to my team and gave the order to prep the OR, my voice as controlled as it had ever been. Because once a decision is made, there's no room for doubt, only execution. As they moved to carry it out, I stepped aside for just a moment, not to think, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge what needed to be acknowledged before I walked into that operating room. I had a conflict of interest. The patient was family, and protocol required that I disclose it. I called Dr. Patel, informed him, directly documented everything, made sure it was recorded properly, because if there was even a chance that my judgment could be questioned later, it needed to be addressed. Now he didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He trusted me, but he stayed on standby, ready to step in if necessary, and that was enough. That was all I needed to move forward. When I scrubbed in, I looked at my reflection briefly in the metal surface across from me. The mask, the cap, the uniform that had become a second identity. And for a moment, I saw both versions of myself at the same time. The one who had been cut off, dismissed, erased, and the one who now stood here as the person responsible for saving the life of the one who had caused it. And then that moment passed, because it had to, because the person on the table wasn't my past. She was a patient, and that distinction was the only way this would work. I walked into the operating room, and everything narrowed down to the essentials. The lights overhead, the instruments laid out with precision, the steady rhythm of monitors that told us how much time we had left. I took my position, asked for the scalpel, and began the first incision. Clean, controlled, exactly where it needed to be from that point forward. There was no room for anything else, no space for memory or emotion or history. Only anatomy, damage repair, step-by-step clamp suction. Identify the source of bleeding, control. It moved to the next. My hands moved the way they had been trained to. Precise, efficient, responding to each development. Without hesitation, the spleen was beyond saving. We removed it. The liver injury was more complex, deeper than it initially appeared, requiring careful suturing, layered repair to stabilize the bleeding without causing further damage. The team followed my lead without question, each person doing exactly what needed to be done at exactly the right time. And as the hours passed, the situation began to shift slowly at first, then more clearly, the bleeding controlled vitals, stabilizing the immediate danger starting to recede. By the time we reached the final stages of the procedure, the room felt different, not relaxed but steady. The kind of steadiness that comes when you know you've crossed the most critical point. I placed the final sutures, checked the repair, confirmed stability, and stepped back, signaling that we were done. The time was just before 7 in the morning, nearly 4 hours since the patient had arrived. 4 hours that existed completely separate from everything else. And as I removed my gloves and stepped away from the table, I knew that what it came next would be something entirely different because the surgery was over, but the reality of what had just happened was only beginning. When I stepped out of the operating room, the world felt louder than it should have. Like everything that had been muted for the past 4 hours came rushing back all at once. The sounds of monitors, footsteps in the hallway, distant, conversations, all of it, returning in a way that made it hard to separate what mattered from what didn't. I removed my cap, adjusted my coat, and walked toward the surgical waiting area with the same steady pace I used for every case. Because from the outside, nothing about this could look different. Not yet through the glass doors. I could already see them sitting side by side, but not really together. My parents 5 years older than the last time I had seen them, but still, instantly recognizable. My mother's posture, tense hands, clasped tightly in her lap. My father leaning forward slightly, like he was trying to hold himself in place. Through sheer focus alone for a moment, I just stood there, not moving, not thinking, just taking in the reality of it because this was the first time that our worlds had overlapped, since everything had fallen apart, and there was no way to undo that, no way to prepare for it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the shift, I was immediate. My father stood up, first instinctively the way people do when they see the doctor responsible for someone they love, his eyes searching my face before dropping to the name badge on my chest. Then back up again, and I watched the recognition happen in real time, slow at first, then all at once, like something breaking through a barrier he didn't know was there. My mother followed. A second later, her expression already fragile before it changed into something else entirely, something closer to shock. Neither of them spoke right away, and in that silence I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one waiting to be acknowledged. They were. I was standing there in a position they couldn't ignore, not because of who I was to them, but because of what I had just done. I spoke first. My voice, even professional, controlled the same tone I used with every family in this room. He introduced myself, formally stated my role, explained the injuries, the procedure, the outcome. I said that the surgery had been successful, that the bleeding had been controlled, that she was stable, and would be moved to the ICU for monitoring. I gave them the information they needed, nothing more, nothing less, because that was my responsibility. Not the history between us, not the questions that were already forming in their minds, just the facts. My mother took a step forward, her hands lifting slightly, like she didn't know what to do with them, her voice breaking as she said my name, not the formal version, not the one I had introduced myself with, but the one she had used when I was a child. And for a split second, something inside me reacted to that, something automatic, something that hadn't completely disappeared, but I didn't move closer. I didn't respond the way she expected. I held my position a small distance. That meant more than it looked like. My father tried to speak next, but the words didn't come out right away. He looked at me, then away, then back again, like he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality at the same time. He finally managed to ask a question, but it wasn't about the surgery. It wasn't about her condition. It was about me. How was this possible? How was I standing here in front of him like this, and I could see it in his expression. The confusion, the doubt, the realization that whatever he had believed for the past 5 years didn't align with what he was seeing now. I answered him the same way I had answered every other question, with clarity. Without emotion, I told him the truth, not as a defense, not as an argument, but as a statement of fact, that I had never left medical school, that I had taken a documented leave, that I had completed my training, that I had been working here for years, and as I spoke, I could feel the weight of it settling in the room, not because of what I was saying, but because of what it meant, because every sentence dismantled something they had accepted without question. My mother covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. My father stood completely still, like if he moved, everything might collapse faster, and in that moment I understood something that I hadn't fully grasped before, that the truth doesn't always need to be proven. Sometimes it just needs to exist long enough in front of someone for them to realize what. They chose not to see. One of the nurses approached quietly from behind me, informing me that the patient had been transferred and was stable, that the ICU team was taking over. I nodded. I acknowledged it, and then turned back to them, because my part here was technically finished. I had done what I was required to do. Anything beyond that was no longer about medicine, and I wasn't obligated to stay. For that, my mother took another step forward, her voice barely steady as she tried to speak again, but I raised my hand slightly, not in rejection, not in anger, just enough to stop the moment from becoming something I wasn't ready to handle. I told them they would be able to see her soon, that the staff would guide them, and then I stepped back, creating distance again. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much, and I needed control more than anything else. As I turned to leave, I heard my mother say something soft, almost, a whisper asking what they had done, and for the first time my father didn't respond, didn't correct, didn't defend. He just stood there in silence, and that silence said more than anything he could have tried to explain. I walked out of the room without looking back, because whatever came next wasn't going to happen in that space, not in a hallway, not in the immediate aftermath of something that had already changed everything. It would happen later, when the shock had settled, when the reality had fully taken hold, and when they were ready to face not just what had happened to her, but what they had done to me. I didn't go back to the ICU that day after speaking to them, not because I didn't care about the patient, but because my role in that moment had been completed. The surgery was successful. The post-operative team was in control, and anything beyond that would have blurred a line I had spent years learning how to maintain. Instead, I continued with my shift, moving from one case to another, signing charts, reviewing labs, speaking with residents, doing everything I would normally do. And on the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath it there was a tension that hadn't been there before. Not overwhelming, not distracting, just present, like something waiting for the right moment to be addressed. I didn't put them again until later that afternoon when I was finishing rounds, and one of the nurses told me there were visitors asking for me. She didn't need to say who. I already knew. I found them in a quiet waiting area near the ICU, sitting closer together than they had been that morning, but still carrying the same weight in their expressions. My mother stood up as soon as she saw me. My father followed more slowly, like he was still adjusting to the reality of a situation. And for a few seconds, none of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. My mother broke first, her voice unsteady, apologizing before she could even form a complete sentence, the words coming out quickly, overlapping as if she was trying to make up for 5 years of silence all at once. My father didn't interrupt her, didn't try to take control of the conversation the way he used to. He just stood there listening, and that alone told to me more than anything he could have said. When she finished, I didn't. I respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to be precise. I told them I believed they were sorry, but that regret and repair were not the same thing, and that what had happened wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up in a single conversation. It was a series of choices repeated over time, Choices to believe one version of events without question, to ignore every attempt I made, to explain to close the door completely, instead of leaving even a small space for doubt. My father finally spoke, then his voice lower than I remembered, asking what they could do now. Not defensively, not demanding, but genuinely. And that question mattered more than the apology, because it acknowledged something had to change. I told them the truth again, the same way I had told it in the hallway. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about setting boundaries. I explained that I had built a life without them not, out of anger but out of necessity, that everything I had now existed independently of their approval, and that if they wanted to be part of it, moving forward, it would have to be on different terms, not the ones we had before, not the ones that allowed assumptions to replace communication. I told them I needed time, not as a punishment, but as a process, that trust wasn't something that returned just. Because the truth was revealed, it had to be rebuilt, slowly, consistently, through actions, not words. My mother nodded through tears. My father didn't argue, didn't try to negotiate. He just listened, and in that moment, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Not authority, not certainty, but the absence of it. Like he was finally questioning something he had always assumed was correct over the next few days. The rest of the truth came out, not through confrontation, but through evidence. My Aunt Ruth brought everything she had kept, emails I had sent that were never answered, documents, proving my leave of absence records of my return, messages from my sister asking her to stay quiet. All of it laid out in a way that couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted. And piece by piece, the version of reality they had accepted for 5 years began to collapse. My mother read everything, every line, every attachment, as if she was trying to understand not just what had happened, but how she had allowed it to happen. My father didn't say much, but his silence was different now, not dismissive but heavy, like he was carrying something he didn't know how to put down. My sister tried to explain when she was stable enough to talk, but the explanations didn't hold the same weight they once did. Not because they were less convincing, but because they were being heard in a different context. One where the truth had already been established, and for the first time, she didn't control the narrative. The consequences of that weren't loud or dramatic. There was no confrontation that ended everything in a single moment. Instead, it was quieter, more permanent. Trust shifted. Relationships changed. The roles everyone had played for years no longer fit the same way, and that was something none of us could undo. Weeks later, I met my parents again, this time outside the hospital at a place I chose. Neutral, controlled, where I could leave if I needed to. We talked not about the past in detail, but about what moving forward might look like. I set conditions not out of anger, but out of clarity, honesty, consistency, accountability, things that should have always been there, but weren't. They agreed, not because it was easy, but because they understood there was no alternative if they wanted to be part of my life again. And that was the difference between then and now. Before, I had been trying to earn a place in their world. Now they were asking for a place in mine. And that shift changed everything. Not the history, not the years that had been lost, but the direction of what came next. I didn't forgive everything all at once. Forgiveness isn't a single decision. It's a process that unfolds over time. And sometimes it doesn't look the way people expect. Sometimes it's just the choice to stop carrying something that no longer serves you, to put it down without pretending it never existed. My life didn't reset after that. It didn't suddenly become complete, but it became something else, something defined by my choices instead of my past. And for the first time, I understood that closure doesn't come from other people admitting they were wrong. It comes from deciding that what happened no longer controls who you are going to be.